Hello, and welcome to this Decology learning series created by Decagon Studios for ArtStation Learning. My name is Clinton Crumpler, and I'm the art director at Decagon Studios. Today I'd like to welcome you to this educational lesson on creating weapons using Blender. Blender continues to gain traction as many artists' favorite tool and modeling program of choice. Using Blender, in this lesson we'll discuss the workflow that can be used in a production scenario for concepting, crafting, and fully realizing a gun asset. Knowing the correct production steps and how they would apply to Blender-specific tools will help you to understand a realistic production pipeline and process to integrate into your own workflows. I would now like to introduce you to your ultra-talented instructor, Alex Medina. Alex is a master of his craft at making weapons for games, and I'm excited to share and hear more about his practices throughout his lesson. On that note, let's pass it to Alex.
Hello. Welcome to this ArtStation learning series about weapon production in Blender, in collaboration with Decagon. My name is Alex Medina, and I'm currently Senior Hard Surface Artist at Crytek, working on the game Hand Showdown. While I am now specialized in weapon art, I also have experience as an environment and prop artist, working in the games Cyberpunk 2077 and Blood and Truth. I went to college in my hometown Valencia, Spain, where I got a degree in architecture, after which I attended a master's degree in 3D art for games. I've been working in the industry since early 2018, and since then I've used most major 3D packages in my day-to-day work: 3ds Max, Maya, and Blender. Nowadays though, my main focus is Blender, and since 2019 with the final 2.8 release, I have successfully converted most of my coworkers. Even with its quirks, I think Blender is an amazing piece of software, and I love being free from expensive recurring licenses, especially when doing freelance or personal work. I like to keep Blender customization to a minimum, so as to not make my use of the program depend on third-party plugins or tools that may break after every update. It's also a good thing to keep in mind if we plan on following online guides and tutorials. Blender is a very keyboard-dependent software, and it's not a great idea to remap all the keys before knowing which ones are useful or most utilized. My advice is to not try to use it like a different program that we are more accustomed to, but instead learn its quirks and try to embrace them, especially if you want to jump ship completely. Trust me, life is better without gizmos. That said, some basic add-ons are great to speed up small tasks, like radial arrays or lattices, or add much needed functionality, especially UV tools. It's also very useful to embrace the search function, which tells you where each command is and its hotkey, and also the quick favorites menu for common actions that don't have or need a hotkey. Some personal notes on useful remaps and quick favorites can be found in my Blender guide document. In this first course, I will give an introduction to the weapon art discipline. While the rest of the series will take place in Blender, this first course is mostly software agnostic, describing the main ideas and concepts we will encounter when working on 3D weapons. This tutorial is made for intermediate students with some knowledge of the basics of 3D art who want to know more about weapon art for games. That said, in Chapter 2 we will still cover some technical terms that might be confusing for beginners, so feel free to stick around even if you're new. In the first chapter, we will discuss the peculiarities of making weapons for games, and how they differ from portfolio projects, from pipeline changes to legality. Then, in Chapter 2, we will go over some useful technical terms for beginners like texel density, poly count, or mesh shading. On Chapter 3, we will introduce the Boolean modeling workflow, explaining how to break down shapes and talking about the importance of manufacturing processes in the final look of weapons. The next 3 chapters will showcase this Boolean workflow by quickly modeling an M16 handguard, a muzzle brake, and an SMG stock. Later, in Chapter 7, we will learn how to choose great references, what makes weapons visually attractive, and how to make our portfolio stand out. Finally, in Chapter 8, we will showcase 3 different groups of weapon references and highlight their good and bad aspects, discussing how to best employ them to improve our weapon projects. So without further ado, let's get started. Making weapons for games. In our opening chapter, we will discuss weapons in game art, their peculiarities and their myriad technical considerations, from texel density to animation constraints. We will focus on the difference between making a simple portfolio gun versus the complexity of making a fully functional video game weapon. So, you have decided to start making weapons in 3D. Or maybe you're not sure. Let's go over why doing it is a great idea. Weapons can be some of the most difficult 3D props we can model, and they are tricky to execute to perfection, which makes them a great challenge. Weapon art has a high skill ceiling, with plenty of room to grow and improve on all facets of 3D art. They are complex, engaging machines, engineered for maximum utility. I find it fascinating to dissect intricate hard surface shapes like the ones in weapons or vehicles, study where they come from, and distill them to their most basic components. Their deep variety of shapes, sizes, and materials makes them very unique from each other. We can always find one that no one has ever modeled yet. We can focus on shape, language, and design a completely new weapon, or maybe recreate an existing one from throughout history. We can create clean materials for a brand new out-of-the-factory gun, or give it personality and storytelling through elaborate texturing. The possibilities are endless. Small arms development and evolution is a big part of history and has shaped many countries and empires. Often a very small change, like the move from black powder to smokeless powder, or the advent of rifling from smoothbore barrels, have resulted in incredible tactical advantages, some inventions even winning wars on their own. In most games that feature guns, the game usually revolves around them. They are key to the gameplay, taking up a lot of screen space and usage by the players and NPCs. They are the stars of the show, and expectations are usually high for them. Last but not least, my personal love of shooter games. Dumb as it may seem, I honestly think one has to deeply care about a topic to really put in enough hours to get really good at it. Most importantly though, they're just really fun objects to shoot and play with. Our weapon art career will usually start with portfolio weapons. A great portfolio is the first step that will launch us into the world of professional weapon art. And here's the good news. We have total freedom to do whatever we want. It's our portfolio, not anyone else's, so don't let anyone pick your projects for you. There is a big difference in motivation between modeling because we're told to and modeling because we're passionate about the subject. And believe me, you will need motivation to finish these, so choose weapons that are interesting to you and chip away at them. In portfolio pieces, it's better not to over-optimize at the expense of visual quality. Obviously, there should be no unnecessary geometry, but it's better to use more triangles on Texel than not. It's not 1998 anymore. If you think about it from the perspective of a game studio, it's much easier to teach someone how to optimize better than to teach them how to make awesome looking art. Aim high too. It's better to try and achieve a masterpiece, even if we fall short, than to get stuck polishing something that looks bad. Your technical skills and artistic eye will be honed through experience. Doing art for 8+ hours a day is what will truly make you a master. Since there are no dependencies in our personal work, we don't really need a functional prototype or blockout weapon. We can go straight to the detailed base mesh. It should be a relatively quick process anyway, if done with the right workflow. Modeling with live booleans, we won't care much at which step of the pipeline we are in. The shapes will be the same. We will likely showcase our weapon as a whole piece, so there's less of a focus on the first-person view silhouette. Also, since it won't serve a gameplay purpose, we don't need to care about iron sights being functional on screen. Generally, we will care more about making the whole object balanced in terms of geometry, level of detail, textile density, etc. There is some degree of flexibility. Since we control the render conditions completely, we can discreetly hide or even Photoshop away any issues that we might find at the end, which also means that we don't have to care about how the gun looks at lower resolutions or higher LODs. This is obviously not possible in a video game, so put away your clone stamp brush if you want to be a game artist. On the topic of internals, we don't have to simplify anything for performance or budget reasons. We can model everything if we want to, and many artists treat it as a personal challenge to model each and every piece of a 100% functional gun. The question is, would you? Do you even have time for that? Because I certainly don't. In the end, a portfolio's goal is to showcase our skills, both artistic and technical, and both aspects are hugely important in game art. Forgoing the art side will result in lipstick on a pig, something that's technically correct, but makes you wonder why the artist went through all the steps when maybe the reference or idea just wasn't very good. On the other hand, not caring about real-time optimization will make us a cinematic VFX artist, which is equally bad. I kid, of course, hugs to my VFX friends. Portfolio pieces that balance the two aspects and add a pinch of originality are sure to make you stand out from the crowd and get you the art job you want. Now, our goals and restrictions are very different when working on game weapons. As a weapon artist in a studio, our objective is to make a great-looking game that players love, so we have to throw our ego out the window. Game art does not exist in a vacuum, and our decisions should be subordinate to the greater good of our project, not necessarily to show off as artists. This applies to all game assets, but weapons too have to be visually coherent with the game world. Color palette, levels, style, and art direction have to match the game's own. It's important to bring our weapons into their final setting as soon as possible, to make the necessary adjustments, especially during the texturing phase. Sometimes more cartoonish proportions will make weapons look better on screen, since real weapons look very thin and flat. Small side elements like selectors, screws, or serrations, things that visually break up flat surfaces, are often exaggerated for a better overall shading and to catch bigger highlights. There are also a bunch of technical restrictions limiting us. Geometry is cheap nowadays, so it's mostly memory that prevents us from using very high texture resolutions, especially with consoles in mind. PC games can usually afford a bit more. That said, weapons are small but expensive props, so they are heavily optimized to avoid wasting performance. Meshes and textures are usually designed to work at lower specs. Smaller model details should also be baked underneath themselves to make sure the model looks consistent in LODs after we remove those pieces from the geometry. Texture details often have to be exaggerated, adding contrast to make sure the texture does not become visually flat when seen at lower resolutions. In a portfolio piece, we control the only render conditions and quality, so we can ignore this and safely use as much texel as we want. The function of the gun's mechanisms, especially the internal ones, which might only be visible for a short time, is often simplified in order to make the rig easier and cheaper. Fewer moving parts mean fewer bones and joints, and also fewer headaches for technical artists and animators. It is not necessary to reproduce the exact mechanisms inside, but we still have to take care of the visible parts. The bolt and chamber are usually exposed while shooting, and the top part of magazines is often visible while reloading, even if it's only for a split second. Some weapon parts, animations, or mechanisms can absolutely be unrealistic to serve gameplay purposes like balancing the game's meta. Examples of these include simplified reloads with less actions, quicker or slower cycling to affect rate of fire, or tighter or wider iron sights to balance a weapon's power level. In older, less realistic shooters, interesting weapon elements like the ejection port were mirrored to be visible from the left, whereas they would normally be on the right side of the weapon to avoid interfering with the operator. In-game weapons, the working prototype model is extremely important. It allows us to check the gun's operation in-engine and make sure everything looks and works fine. Pieces fit together, 3D proportions, camera placement, iron sights, etc. Speaking of iron sights, we need to take special care modeling them for games. Their shape and size are modified to allow better aiming on the game's first-person camera, as opposed to in real life, where precision requires a very narrow sight picture. We will often have to exaggerate or invent new sight shapes in service of good gameplay. Silhouette is an important concept for 3D artists, and doubly so for weapon artists. First-person weapons sit very close to the camera in a skewed perspective. We will need to devote many extra polygons to make sure there's no visible stepping around the gun's silhouette, especially in the areas around the iron sights. Of course, the silhouette and main weapon shapes will be different depending on the game's camera type. Knowing how the gun will be presented on screen and examining which areas will be clearly seen is as important as knowing how it looks. The key word here is readability. In the player's hand or the NPCs, weapons and attachments should be identifiable. For a third-person shooter, the most important shapes of the gun will need to be scaled up to compensate for their smaller size on screen, and also depending on their weapon type and power level. Compare, for example, the footprint of a small suppressed pistol versus a huge rocket launcher. In first-person shooters, shapes will mainly have to look great in, surprise surprise, the first-person camera. We will need to think about the presentation of its main elements, the weapon position relative to the crosshair, the size and location of attachments so they're well visible, etc. Weapons are gameplay elements, so just as the UI, they need to inform the player of things like their operation state, told by its mechanisms, loaded, empty, cocked, their weapon class, distinguished by their main features. If we see a prominent cylinder, then it's a revolver. If we see a big scope, then it's a sniper. Their special ammunition, seen directly or when reloading. Fire arrows, explosive ammunition, grenade launchers. Lastly, weapon dependencies will require deep communication with many different departments, as we will discuss on the next slide. As you can quickly appreciate, there are some differences in the game art pipeline that make it more complex than a simple portfolio piece pipeline. The base workflow is the same. First, get the blockout and base mesh, obtain the high and low poly meshes from it, bake the details from the first into the second, and then texture the result. For game art weapons, though, we get some extra steps. First are in-engine tests to check that the weapon's size and proportions fit correctly on camera, in the different aiming poses. This has to happen as early as possible in production, because the feedback from these will drive the main shapes of the gun. Before the high poly stage, we need a working prototype to unblock the other departments' tasks. This way, tech art, animation, and tech design can start working in parallel while the final art is produced. This prototype weapon can be simplified, but its proportions and size should be accurate, and it must include all moving parts, so the rig and animations can be created. There are also some important optimization steps in game art. During low poly and baking, we will prepare our models to work at lower resolutions by having an LOD strategy. We will make life easier for ourselves if we plan how to simplify a low poly model and load it at the same time as we are modeling it. Also, to reduce the amount of texture memory we use, this is the phase where we decide which parts to give more texel, which parts to shrink, and which parts to mirror. After the bake, when low poly and UVs are final, we create the LODs and then send the whole thing to TechArt for skinning so they can apply the prototype weapon's existing rig. Finally, and unless we need to do some kind of marketing shots, we will relinquish lighting and rendering our model. Instead, we will need to integrate all of our files in the engine, submit meshes, textures, create material instances, and otherwise make sure that everything is working properly. A sort of personal quality assurance step, if you will. Iron sights are one of the most important elements of a digital weapon because of their gameplay implications. Initially, games only had hip-fire shooting and simplified sniper scopes, but eventually they added the option to aim down the sights in all weapons for a more accurate, long-distance shooting. Their modeling must be very, very detailed and precise, but also exaggerated to account for the difference between the IRL eye and the in-game camera. Because of this, we need to study the design and functionality of each sight and scope to be able to tweak it without renouncing its original purpose and essence. Common iron sights corrections for the game camera include changing their size, making elements bigger and thicker, for example the front sight's thin metal blades, to be more visible on camera. Also changing the overall design of the sights, for example going from an aperture sight with a pinhole to an open sight with just a notch. Aperture sights, unless heavily tweaked, don't work too well in video games because they block off a big portion of the target. As the ones in charge of the weapons, we will sometimes be the ones configuring the weapon position and alignment in engine. We'll have to make sure the weapon feels like it's aiming at the center of the screen. It needs to look like the bullets will go toward the actual crosshair. We can achieve this by making sure the perspective lines from the longer elements of the gun and additional elements like scopes are flowing towards it. Aiming speed and comfort should be the realism here, so we need to clearly display on screen where our shots will go and care not to cover too much of the screen with our weapon. This can also achieve the opposite effect. A lowered weapon state, for example while vaulting or sprinting, informs the player that shooting is not possible at the time. To make our life easier, we will have to check how weapons look in first-person perspective while modeling. Ideally, we should do this in engine with a prototype model to be as accurate as possible to how it will finally be displayed in the game. This is not always possible though, since final poses might not be done in time, so we might need to piece together some kind of temporary configuration for testing purposes. We can also do it by placing a camera in our scene, although it is difficult to perfectly match the game's camera zoom level and field of view. We also need to check the iron sights in ADS view. We can place another camera to check the sights more closely. Sometimes elements like the hammer can block the iron sights, especially in older weapons, so it's better to have the element's movement animated to quickly check while modeling. On screen, the player doesn't need to bother aligning the front and rear sights, so good target visibility is our most important goal. Modern shooter games usually allow for a range of weapon attachments and variants. This calls for a heavily modular approach, where each interchangeable part of the weapon is treated like a unique piece, just as we would do with modular environment sets, instead of just packing everything together. Breaking up weapons in chunks means we only need to load the necessary parts and attachments we are using at any given time, saving on texture memory by being able to use smaller and more optimized, sometimes non-uniform, texture sets. This also allows for further optimization of the parts far away from the camera by reducing their texel density. The benefits to this system are manifold. We are able to easily upgrade standard weapon parts, like swapping the magazine of a weapon to an extended one. We can add all kinds of attachments like optical sights, grips, lasers, flashlights, etc. We can create weapon variants, like a shotgun with a sawn-off barrel and stock, or a pistol with an elongated barrel. We can swap the material of a single part, say a pistol grip that's made of ivory instead of wood, without requiring to re-export the texture of all other parts. The modular approach, nonetheless, has some downsides. Using many texture sets makes it more difficult to texture, especially to keep materials looking similar in different texel densities or texture ratios. We can fight this by using material instances in Substance Painter, having the master material in one of the sets and then just instances in the secondary ones. This helps a bit, but sets with different texture ratios will still have to be manually adjusted, so it's not ideal. Separate meshes also mean separate LODs. We will need to make sure that they fit together even if they don't kick in at the exact same time, avoiding clipping or geometry gaps. To counter this, elements wrapped around the guns like straps or soft cloth covers should be scaled up a bit from the base mesh so they never clip even between different LOD levels. Weapon skins are another important part of the weapon artist's job. Live game shooters are very popular these days, and one of the main ways to monetize them are customization items. Skins for characters, weapon or vehicles, stickers, graffiti, emotes, animations, the possibilities are quite literally endless. In shooters that include weapon skins, these tasks tend to be way more common than full weapons. Why? Well, a whole new weapon involves a huge amount of work for not only art, but nearly every other department that is remotely connected to it. Design, code, animation, sound, VFX, tech art. Weapon skins, on the other hand, require more focus on the art and design side of the pipeline. Not only do they have to be new, original, and look awesome, but also fit within the game's art direction and lore, and not to be too crazy to finish in a realistic timeframe. An extra difficulty is adding mesh attachments to screens, because straps, trinkets, and cloth covers all need to fit existing animations, and they have to avoid clipping with the hand poses or obstructing the iron sights. Even with this in mind, dependencies for weapon skins are usually small to none. Unless some new trinket is dangling or animated in some way, we won't need to involve any other departments besides concept art and 3D art. This makes them quick and cheap to finish, and thus they have become the base of many a game's monetization strategies. Of course, some skins for more fantastic or stylized games go the extra mile and make them premium, including new animations, VFX, sounds, etc., which complicate the task quite a bit more than a simple art revamp. These, in turn, tend to be more expensive for the consumer. Because of the simplicity and granularity of these tasks, they are very easy to outsource to external studios and keep the core team focused on newer, more interconnected features. Lastly, some small tips for skin creation. A strong idea or theme is key, and having some kind of narrative to support it helps sell it. Approach the skin like you would approach any art piece. Consider its composition, contrast, and levels. References are important, not so much for design as for ideas, materials, and details. Mix and match cool stuff. Consider the in-game view, don't just design it from the side perspective, make sure it also looks great on the in-game camera. Next up are dependencies. As weapon artists, we sit near the beginning of a very long pipeline, which involves many other departments: technical art, animation, audio, game design, VFX, even marketing. We have to be very communicative, state our expectations, explain how things work, and keep an eye on the weapon through all the stages of development to make sure everything is understood. It usually pays off to set up informative meetings with the teammates who will take over our work sooner than later. We have to treat weapons like animated characters rather than static props, and think of all the steps that will have to be undertaken after the art is done, like rigging, skinning, and animations. We need to be aware of all of those and discuss them with the respective teams, since they will be instrumental in how the actual weapon works in-game. For example, the animation pose will drive the silhouette on screen and define which important weapon elements and details are more visible. Since we will start working on the weapon art before the rig, a small trick to thoroughly check the weapon is exporting several static versions of it into the engine, specifically all the cycling stages. For example, in a bolt-action rifle like an old-timey sniper, this would be a closed bolt and an open pulled-back bolt that exposes the inside of the receiver. We won't be able to see them in motion until tech art and animation have done their jobs, but that doesn't mean we can't test how they look. We need to identify potential issues as soon as possible. Weapons are complex machines that consist of many moving parts. Unless we're making a static secondary prop, we will have to ensure weapon parts are detailed enough that the quality holds up while cycling it, or when it remains static in an open position, like when the magazine is empty. Of course, we usually don't need to create all of the pieces inside each weapon. We have to identify which parts will be exposed during animation and focus on those. The best way to do this is making simple animations ourselves. I will go deeper into how to create these animations in Lesson 2 of the series. We also have to verify that moving pieces fit perfectly and do not poke through each other or expose gaps in the geometry. We have to check that the scale of the weapon and the pieces fits the scale of the character's hands. Very frequently, in first-person shooters, hands are a bit bigger to look better on camera, so we might have to tweak the size of or proportion of our weapons, especially in smaller ones. These issues will have to be detected during the prototype phase, or else we would risk scrapping a lot of more time-consuming work down the line. For this reason, it's important that our prototype meshes are very exact. All the moving parts should be present already, so the tech artists and animators can then just replace them with the final art painlessly. Tech artists and animators will have to redo work, such as skinning or posing, if we aren't thorough enough with the prototype, and the final weapon is different from it. To end this first chapter, we'll talk about the legality of digital weapons. Firearms in video games sit in a muddy legal territory. On the one hand, it could be a mutually beneficial arrangement for both the game developer and the weapon manufacturer to have realistically portrayed weapons in a game, giving verisimilitude to the game and free exposure to the products to the gun companies. On the other hand, developers would have to obtain the company's permission to use their IP and trademarks, and it could be revoked at any point if their weapon is displayed in a bad light or to portray acts that the company doesn't agree to. That said, after several PR incidents involving video games and guns, the norm now is game studios wanting to distance themselves from the weapon industry. They do not want to be accused of supporting gun violence by being in any kind of agreement with the weapons manufacturers. Special cases are military arms and designations, which are historical items, financed with public money and are at least partly in the public domain. This makes their use safer than commercial guns manufactured by private companies. It would be very unlikely that a government would go after a game company for copyright infringement, but not so much a private company. That said, there are precedents, in the US at least, of fair use of trademarked guns in video games under the First Amendment, comparing games to other artistic works such as books or movies. Some common weapon modifications to avoid IP infringement risks are brand, logos, and model names. These are the first ones that go out the window. Brands are usually very strict about the use of their logos and product names, so these are usually a no-no. This concern is where all the funny weapon names from video game history come from. Big game studios often double-check with lawyers whether they can use certain weapon names in their games. Weapon visuals. It's not necessary to completely redesign every gun, but it's safer to change some percentage of the visuals. As a rule of thumb, I've heard the number 20% before. Function or operation. Modifying the specifications and capabilities of a weapon is another way of differentiating it from the original. Cartridge type, automatic or semi-automatic, rate of fire, effective distance, iron sights, etc. In conclusion, intellectual property laws are very different around the world, so it's common sense to keep things as safe as possible, especially when using weapons in a commercial project.